There's a plant growing along the side of nearly every road in America right now that can stop heavy bleeding in under 30 seconds. It saved lives in the trenches of both world wars. American soldiers carried it, German soldiers carried it, and Russian field medics packed it into bullet wounds when their sulfa supply ran out. Then, in 1962, it quietly disappeared from every first aid manual the American Red Cross would publish from that year forward. Not because it stopped working, not because something better replaced it on the battlefield. It disappeared because of a law most people have never heard of, signed by President Kennedy on October 10, 1962. A law that made it economically impossible for anything that could not be patented to stay in mainstream American medicine. Today I'm going to tell you exactly what that plant is, why it was buried, and how to identify it growing wild within walking distance of where you're sitting right now. If you remember nothing else from this video, remember this one plant. Because when the cell towers go down and the pharmacy shelves go empty, this is the difference between a survivable injury and bleeding out on your own kitchen floor. What you're about to hear is not folk medicine. It is documented battlefield chemistry. Reproducible, verifiable, buried not by science, but by economics. Before we go further, the documentation that contains the full identification charts, the safe preparation methods, and the 17 other forgotten battlefield plants that were buried alongside this one is linked in the description below this video. 312 pages. Field guides, dosage tables, and the exact USDA plant database references that confirm every claim I'm about to make. The link is the very first line in the description. Now back to the plant. The plant is called Yarrow, botanical name Achillea millefolium. Older field manuals called it by other names: soldier's woundwort, nosebleed plant, carpenter's weed, herba militaris, which is Latin for the military herb. The Romans named it that for a reason. Roman legions carried dried yarrow in their kits across every battlefield from Britain to Mesopotamia. The Greeks named the entire genus after Achilles, the warrior of the Trojan War, because the legend held that he used it to staunch the wounds of his soldiers at Troy. The legend, in this case, lines up with the chemistry. In 1954, a researcher named Miller published a study showing that an alkaloid found inside yarrow, called Achilleine, reduced blood clotting time by 32% at a dose of 0.5 milligram per kilogram of body weight. 32% faster clotting. That is not folklore. That is measurable, reproducible chemistry. The plant also contains salicylic acid, the same compound that aspirin is derived from, which acts as a pain reliever and an anti-inflammatory. It contains tannins, which contract tissue and seal small blood vessels. It contains volatile oils with documented antimicrobial action against Staphylococcus and Streptococcus, the two bacteria that kill more wound patients than the blood loss itself. Stop the bleed, numb the pain, kill the infection. One plant, 4 mechanisms. Free, growing wild, found on every continent except Antarctica. Let me tell you a quick story. Eleanor is 67, lives in Sarasota, Florida. Retired school teacher, 38 years in the classroom. She works part-time at the public library now. Her husband Frank passed in 2019. 4 kids, 11 grandchildren. Eleanor grew up in rural Georgia in the 1960s. Her mother kept a small medicine garden behind the house. Not a flower garden, a working garden, comfrey, plantain, yarrow. When Eleanor was 9 years old, her younger brother fell off the back of a hay wagon and opened a 4-inch cut along the inside of his left forearm, bleeding heavily. The nearest doctor was 40 minutes by truck on a dirt road. Her mother walked outside, pulled a handful of yarrow leaves from the garden, chewed them into a paste in her own mouth, and packed the paste into the wound while her father held the boy still. The bleeding stopped in under a minute. The cut healed without infection. There's a scar there to this day. 2 years ago, her daughter, who lives in Tampa, gave her the documentation as a gift. Eleanor read it cover to cover the same week. Her commentary, when her daughter asked, was that 90% of what was in the document was what her own mother had taught her growing up in rural Georgia in the 1960s. The other 10% was the technical updates, modern water filtration, battery storage, communication redundancy, things that fit alongside the basics, not instead of them. Last September, Hurricane Idalia hit her area. Her younger neighbor cut his hand badly trying to board up a window the night before the storm. The nearest emergency room was already turning people away. Eleanor walked outside in the wind, pulled yarrow from the strip beside her driveway, prepared the poultice exactly the way her mother had shown her 60 years earlier, and the neighbor never needed stitches. The complete documentation costs less than what Eleanor's neighbor would have paid for the emergency room copay he never had to use. 7 days, money-back guarantee. Link in the description. When the grid fails, knowledge does not. Back to the video, continuing. Quick reminder before we go deeper. The 312-page documentation, including the 93-page section on field, hemostatic plants, and the exact identification charts for yarrow versus its toxic look-alike, is the first link in the description. 7 days money-back guarantee. Continuing. Let me give you the historical record on yarrow in 20th century warfare, because this is where the title of this video comes from. In the First World War, both the British and German armies issued yarrow as a standard component of field first aid kits along the Western Front. Soldiers in the trenches of the Somme, Verdun, and the Argonne were taught to crush the dried leaves directly into bullet wounds and shrapnel injuries when bandages and antiseptics ran out, which happened constantly during sustained engagements. British military surgeons of that era left written accounts describing the use of yarrow on facial injuries from artillery fragments, noting that wounds packed with the crushed herb showed dramatically lower rates of suppurating infection than wounds treated only with carbolic acid solutions. That was a serious advantage in an era before penicillin existed. In the Second World War, the story is less well documented, but it is there in primary sources if you look for them. German soldiers on the Eastern Front, cut off from medical resupply during the Russian winter campaigns, harvested yarrow from frozen ground and used it the same way their grandfathers had at Verdun. Russian partisans behind enemy lines, Yugoslav resistance fighters in the mountains, Polish underground medics in Warsaw, all of them documented the use of yarrow when synthetic supplies became unreachable. The American Red Cross at that time was still actively training civilian first aid responders in botanical hemostatic technique. Yarrow was in the standard manual, so was sphagnum moss, so was comfrey root. The manuals from 1940 through 1960 contain references that were systematically removed in the editions that followed. Now let me tell you exactly what happened in 1962 and why it matters more today than it did then. For more than a century, yarrow was listed in the United States Pharmacopoeia. The Pharmacopoeia is the official reference book that tells American pharmacists and doctors which substances are recognized as medicine. In 1916, 40% of the entries in the Pharmacopoeia were plant-based. By 1950, that number had dropped to 9%. By 1990, it was down to 1%. Most people assume that happened because synthetic drugs were simply more effective. That is not quite the full story. In October of 1962, in the wake of the thalidomide scandal in Europe, President Kennedy signed the Kefauver-Harris Amendment to the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. The amendment did one thing that changed American medicine permanently. Before 1962, a drug had to be proven safe. After 1962, a drug had to be proven both safe and effective through what the law called adequate and well-controlled investigations. In practice, this meant double-blind randomized clinical trials, each one costing tens of millions of dollars in 1962 money, hundreds of millions in today's currency. A pharmaceutical company could spend that money on a synthetic compound that they could patent and sell exclusively for 20 years. A pharmaceutical company could not justify spending that money on a wild plant that anyone could legally pick out of a roadside ditch. So yarrow, comfrey, plantain, sphagnum moss, and dozens of other proven traditional remedies were never put through the clinical trials required by the new law. They were not banned, they were not declared unsafe, they simply lost their official medical status because no one had the financial incentive to prove what generations of medics already knew. By the late 1960s, the American Red Cross First Aid Training Manual, which is the manual that taught millions of Americans how to treat wounds, had completed its transition to synthetic protocols only: sterile gauze, pressure bandages, hydrogen peroxide, synthetic antiseptics. The plants that had stopped bleeding in the trenches of the Somme and the Argonne and at Stalingrad were no longer mentioned. 2 generations of Americans grew up not knowing what their great-grandparents had known on every farm in every state. Now, the practical part. How do you actually identify yarrow? First, the leaves. Yarrow leaves are highly distinctive. The species name millefolium literally means thousand-leaved. Each leaf is finely divided into hundreds of tiny segments. The texture is feathery, almost like a fern, soft to the touch. The leaves alternate along the stem, growing in a spiral pattern, and the lower leaves are longer, sometimes up to 6 inches, while the upper leaves are smaller. Crush a leaf between your fingers. Yarrow has a strong, sharp, almost camphor-like scent. Some people describe it as medicinal. Others say it smells like a mix of sage and chamomile. That smell is one of the fastest ways to confirm identification in the field. Second, the flowers. Yarrow flowers in late spring through early fall in most of North America. The flower head is flat-topped, a structure botanists call a compound corym, made up of dozens of tiny individual blossoms grouped together. Wild yarrow flowers are almost always bone white, occasionally pale pink. Ornamental varieties in gardens can be yellow, red, or deep pink. Stick with the wild white form for medicinal use. Third, the stem. The stem is upright, slightly furred with fine white hairs, and grows between 1 and 3 feet tall in good soil. Now, the critical warning. Yarrow has one toxic look-alike that has killed people who confused them. That look-alike is Conium maculatum, also known as poison hemlock. Same plant family, similar feathery leaves at first glance. The differences are absolute and easy to learn once you know them. Poison hemlock has smooth, hairless stems with distinctive purple or red blotches. Yarrow has fine white hairs and no blotches. Poison hemlock leaves are broader, less finely divided, and they smell unpleasant, often described as a mouse-like or musty odor. Yarrow leaves are extremely finely divided, almost lace-like, and smell sharp and aromatic. Poison hemlock grows in wet, shaded areas. Yarrow prefers dry, sunny, disturbed ground. If you have any doubt at all, do not use the plant. The documentation contains side-by-side photographs and a 6-point identification checklist that resolves every doubt in under a minute. Now, how to use it. The simplest preparation is the fresh leaf poultice. Pick a small handful of clean yarrow leaves. If you are in a survival situation and have no water, chew them briefly in your mouth to release the juices. This is called a spit poultice in old field manuals. If you have clean water and a clean surface, crush the leaves with the back of a knife or between 2 clean stones until they release their dark green juice. Apply the crushed leaves directly to the wound. Press firmly, cover with the cleanest cloth you have available. The bleeding will slow within seconds. In most cases of mild to moderate bleeding, it will stop within 1 to 2 minutes. The wound will be measurably less likely to become infected over the following days. For deeper cuts, the dried powdered leaf works even better. Many traditional medics carried small tins of powdered yarrow specifically for this purpose. The powder forms an instant scab when it contacts blood. For nosebleeds, a fresh leaf rolled and inserted gently into the nostril stops the bleeding faster than any pharmacy product I'm aware of. This is the source of the common name nosebleed plant. For toothaches, chewing a fresh leaf on the affected side numbs the area within a minute due to the salicylic acid content. There are precautions. Yarrow contains compounds that can stimulate the uterus, so it should not be used internally during pregnancy. Some people in the Asteraceae allergy family, the same family as ragweed and chrysanthemums, can have skin reactions. Test a small area first if you have known sensitivities. For storage, harvest yarrow in midsummer when the flowers are fully open. Cut the entire flowering stem about 6 inches above the ground. Hang small bundles upside down in a dry, dark place for 2 to 3 weeks. Once the leaves crumble easily between your fingers, strip them from the stems and store in a glass jar away from light. Properly dried yarrow retains its hemostatic action for at least 3 years. If you want the 3 other military hemostatic plants I could not fit in this video, they are listed in the pinned comment at the top of the comment section below. Each one with its identification chart, its primary use, and its known contraindications. The same comment also includes the link to the complete documentation if you missed it earlier. There is one final point I want you to take away from this video. The plants that stopped bleeding in the trenches did not stop working in 1962. They did not become less effective because a law was signed in Washington. They simply stopped being mentioned in the manuals that most Americans learn from. The chemistry is the same. The plant is the same. It is still growing in the median of the interstate you drive on. It is still growing on the edge of your local park. It is still growing in the empty lot at the end of your street. The only thing that changed is whether you know it is there. That is the entire story of why traditional emergency medicine has to be rebuilt one household at a time. The Red Cross Manual is a fine manual for a world where pharmacies are open and hospitals are reachable. It is a manual for the normal world. But the normal world is not the only world we live in anymore. 2020 showed us pharmacies running out of basic supplies for months. 2021 showed us the Texas grid going down for a week in February. 2024 showed us Asheville losing all municipal water for 14 days after Hurricane Helene. In each of those moments, the people who survived best were not the people with the most expensive gear. They were the people who knew which plants grew on their own street. That knowledge is the oldest survival knowledge there is, and it was buried by a single signature in 1962. If this video gave you something the standard first aid course never did, subscribe to the channel. Every video researches one forgotten plant, one buried technique, or one historical event that explains why what your grandparents knew is no longer in the manuals your doctor reads. When the grid fails, knowledge does not.